welcome to another one of our Lunchtime talk lecture series. We have here Charles Snyder, who's one of our postdoctoral fellows this year at the Humanities Center. It's been a pleasure having him. Nice to have him here. He's been teaching at the prison, so we have a high bar to reach for when he is engaged and interesting as the prisoner is, right?
It's true.
Going well. We're going to jump right into it. He's going to give us a quick 10-minute or so, or how long do you want to speak for? Do you want to speak longer? Do you want to run through the whole thing?
I have about 15-20 minutes worth of remarks prepared, but
we'll do 15 or 20 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. The talk is titled Natality and Its Vicissitudes.
Great.
So, Charles.
All right, thank you, Roger, for the occasion and for the year, and thank you all for coming. So I begin in almost total agreement with an insight credited to Aristotle. Human beings capable of great deeds and great words, in the version of Homer, can be the best of animals, and yet these same beings, capable of the most terrible and hateful forms of wickedness, in deed as well as in word, can also be the worst of animals. Such grisly wickedness, Aristotle says in Politics Alpha, 1253a30, grows out of the very same capacity for excellence. The impulse directing human beings to create and recreate the communal space of the polis, Aristotle was already aware, together with the capacity to exercise freely the political excellence of phronesis, or political judgment, practical judgment, is open, both the impulse and the capacity, is open to being used for contrary ends. So the tradition of ancient philosophy, from the pre-Socratics to late antiquity, upheld the belief that humans are capable of imitating the divine. But in view of the atrocities of the 20th century, in particular the Second World War, and the momentum of totalitarian movements, some of us have had a difficult time comprehending the insight of Aristotle's Politics Alpha. We are now undoubtedly aware that humans are capable of actually becoming, never mind imitating, an unprecedented sort of beast. This new beast can maintain a perverse relation to the polis, facilitating through that relation new forms of criminality. Animals other than human, for all we have seen in history so far, remain entirely incapable. The real nightmare of the movement that gave rise to totalitarian government is that humans brought it into existence and carried out its murderous ideology. The outrageous stupidity of Nazi propaganda minister Goebbels, his prediction 2 years before his suicide in Berlin, that we will go down in history as the greatest statesmen of all time, or as their greatest criminals, does not negate the fact that these greatest of criminals appeared to perform for some time before the eyes of the world as statesmen, regardless of whatever political theory or philosophy we might call upon to idealize the essence of real statesmanship. As penetrating and as prescient as Aristotle's basic insight remains, it is too rigid a simplification of the human condition. Human beings, Aristotle should have said, are capable of maintaining life within a polis in a way that ought to be characterized as neither just nor unjust, neither good nor wicked, neither political nor unpolitical. There is, in other words, an intermediate zone, on either side of which it is indeed accurate to say that humans are capable of the worst kinds of wickedness on the one hand and the most exemplary acts of excellence on the other, but between which there lies a zone of the intermediate, vitiating the excesses of excellence and vice. With Augustine's explication of the principle of human natality, in particular the clause antiquem nullis fuit, before whom there was nobody, Arendt translates, a new species of nobody had also been implicated in existence. Speaking as the tragic citizen and ruler of Thebes, Sophocles' King Creon gave expression to this new nobody on the stage of the theater of Dionysus centuries before Augustine, a man who could and did take initiative, disclosing and revealing himself as, quote, no more than nobody, tonugom tomalone medena, that is, a strange nobody and former king responsible for the prosecution of Theban law, the execution of Antigone, and the spiral of death his rule precipitated within his family and his own city. This new nobody is distinct from the mere repetition of those non-political animals that perceive and live outside. The coming to be of human natality and the communal life of the polis. For this new nobody can now distinguish himself, paradoxically, as no more than nobody. Creon had become, by the end of Sophocles' drama, not the opposite or contrary of somebody, but a particular form of nobody that through initiative withdraws himself, the raison activity, from the city, due to the excesses of his political rule, or more precisely, the capacity to banish himself from the city-state he brought to the verge of disaster. One instance of the intermediate state startled Hannah Arendt in Jerusalem. Neither gods nor beasts, creatures entirely without a polis, can maintain a life in this intermediate zone, a form of the living dead, or what Arendt would call the life of the lifeless. Unlike gods or beasts, human beings are beginners, endowed with a supreme capacity, oriented, primarily, to begin something new. This principle or capacity of natality also carries within it, incidentally, a sinister capacity for the contrary, to destroy or annihilate the principle, and the persons who bear it, by a new and unnatural means of destruction, an unprecedented organization of total politicization. The figurative light of the public realm can turn into a capacity for its contrary. Rather than provide a space of appearance for the newcomer to emerge, the light of the public realm darkens the world, and possibly the earth, as the capacity of natality becomes the capacity to annihilate the new. Given the great excesses of the human condition, it has been difficult, to put it mildly, to confront the perverse capacity of human beings to maintain life in the impasse of the between, where the principle of natality no longer takes initiative, including the initiative actively striving to annihilate the principle and other human beings. It is time, then, to affirm what I suspect we have known all along, but neglect to take very seriously. The supreme capacity of human initiative exceeds the one-way capacities that determine the linear movement of nature, where the abilities and capacities of living things swing in changeless, deathless repetition, having only a singular orientation for the exercise of its capacity. Just as fire can only be the capacity to heat or warm, and nothing else besides. But it is also the case that this supreme capacity, exceeding the one-way capacity, also exceeds Aristotle's rigid two-way capacity of contraries. That double orientation, the capacity of living things with logos, I'll translate as discourse for now, can achieve. So that capacities that follow logos, what Aristotle recalls as dunamis meta logu, as a capacity with discourse, sometimes translated as reason or speech, are exploratory. So these capacities that follow logos are exploratory and open in addressing itself to things in oneself. These capacities are oriented towards a certain exercise through logos, thus disclosing what is to be done, and incidentally, the negation and privation of what is to be done. Privation, I hope to make clear in the next set of remarks, has more than one modality. There is then, if I am right, a third vicissitude inscribed within this supreme capacity, Aristotle overlooked, one which reflects another incidental form of a dunamis metalogu, a capacity led by reason or discourse. While the general condition of human natality does consist of a two-way capacity for contraries in conformity with Aristotle's basic insight, so that it can make freedom appear and disappear, it also consists of a capacity for the impasse of freedom and the unique, what is in essence a paradoxical capacity for the banal. In conformity then with Aristotle's example in Metaphysics Theta 2, the doctor's art of medicine consists of the capacity to heal, as well as the sinister capacity to exacerbate and cause disease and excruciating torment, in an expert fashion. Aristotle understood this long before the Nazi physician Dr. Joseph Mengele. Likewise, natality is supreme because it is both awesome and fearsome. And it would not be most awesome without the capacity of ushering in terror and destruction, inasmuch as human beings can set into motion not only the miraculous power of action and freedom, but also the calamitous movement of depriving the world of such miracles, either by physical annihilation or a system of total domination that relies on banal nobodies, those who spend their lives in a gray zone of natal privation. What Ellison would call the walking and talking personification of the negative in the invisible end. The intermediate state or condition of natality finds clarification in Arendt's report on Adolf Eichmann, in the deficiency of his thinking or lack thereof. His banality exemplifies rather precisely one general sense of privation as it relates to the ability and inability of thinking, a state which Arendt referred to with the primitive term thoughtless. His privation was a lack of thinking at a time when beings of his kind would and should naturally have the ability to think. Not in the sense that he was entirely unable to think, but in the sense that he was, as Arendt carefully phrased it, almost totally unable to think. So, citation 2b on the outline that I sent around. It is obvious from the phrase almost entirely, or almost totally, that Arendt had already accounted for the coexistence and collaboration of two contraries in the intermediate zone. Of an intermediate state she rightly understood as a privation or lack of an ability, even when it is still correct to maintain that there is some activity or motion underway, but that the activity has withdrawn from the primary orientation of the capacity, which is to think contraries, in the sense to think from either side, or the enlarged mentality. Beyond Aristotle's rigid simplification of contraries and Arendt's specific characterization of privation in terms of thoughtlessness, there is the most awesome capacity of natality as inherently three-way. Not only do humans primarily strive to be unique, and to the contrary wickedly strive to destroy the unique through politics, humans may also enact with utter banality an intermediate state wherein they abdicate uniqueness and do so without seeking to perpetrate its complete disappearance. In this state, human beings maintain, and are capable only of maintaining, a rather banal form of existence in which natality is almost totally deactivated, where the pursuit of excellence and freedom is no longer possible. To understand how the state of banality serves as the privation of this most awesome capacity, we have to examine Aristotle's metaphysical considerations of dunamis and steresis, otherwise translated as capacity and privation, in conjunction with Arendt's singular observation of banality in relation to the activity of thinking. Doing so will allow us to incorporate more generally the impasse of banality into our understanding of the various activities of the vita activa, not just thinking. We should also confront what Arendt insisted we confront, namely, the reality that the Nazis are men like ourselves, and the nightmare of what man is capable. But we should add that the Nazis as human have shown what human beings through natality are in principle perversely capable. Critics and defenders of Arendt's characterization of thoughtlessness presume that this lack or privation can only have one meaning, namely, that sense of privation which connotes an unqualified lack or pure nothingness. There is unanimous consent among the readers, as far as I can see, that thoughtlessness refers to only one modality of the privation, according to which a person of distinction manifests the privation of thoughtlessness, also manifests the total inability or total incapacity to think. This unqualified notion of privation implies, in turn, a rather vulgar notion of inability or incapacity, such that what is lacking is the ability to think, including any exercise at all of thinking. But this naive sense of privation, or its correlative total inability, is nowhere to be found in Arendt's trial report. The simplistic notions of lack and incapacity that Arendt's readers have in their ignorance resurrected and projected onto her characterization of Eichmann wildly distort Arendt's report. More to the point, this distortion refuses to confront the impasse that haunts the human condition, as well as its corresponding activities. To understand Eichmann, then, and the emergence of this new criminality, it is essential not to lapse back into an old doctrine that concerns the notion of incapacity held by the Megaric school of philosophy in the 4th century BC. Even more essential than providing some criterion to identify the activity of thinking, a task which I leave to the side for the moment. According to Aristotle, the Megaric stated, quote, "A thing can act only when it is acting," and conversely, that a thing cannot act when it is not acting. This is citation 2A on the outline. Metaphysics theta. Absurdities arise from this doctrine, absurdities which stem from the notion of capacity, that is, to be in a state of being able. Aristotle directed his attention exclusively to the McGarrick view of being able, since the metaphysical notion of capacity or potentiality is one of the four modes of existence, according to Aristotle, or one of the four modes in which we use the verb is. The other three being form and matter, we refer to a thing, thing's existence in terms of its form or its matter, its substance and accident, and whether it's true or false. And the fourth mode again being whether it's active and potential. It is the notion of incapacity which is important for the purpose of understanding the banality of life. And it is this notion that Aristotle's task in Metaphysics Theta leads him to neglect. He's more interested in capacity than he is in incapacity. For Aristotle, the McGarrick doctrine consists of a vulgar notion of what it means for a being of any kind to have a capacity, not because the doctrine denies the existence of capacities as real, but because the account denies the existence of capacities when they are not being exercised. The McGarrick seems to have believed that if a being is not doing X, then it is unable to do X at the moment it is not doing X. Aristotle criticizes this doctrine as absurd, for it generates the trivial explanation that if something is deprived of the capacity to do X, and determined incapable or unable to do X, then doing X either is or will be incapable of ever occurring. For instance, my not exercising right now the capacity to stand at this moment leads the McGarrick to the view that I do not have the capacity to stand at the moment, making me unable to stand, according to Aristotle, either now or ever. The motivation for Aristotle's criticism of the McGarrick doctrine is clear. It is absurd to deny the distinction between the being of capacity and the being of activity, namely as two distinct ways of existence. The McGarrick doctrine would leave us with no way to explain the acquisition and loss of skill. For instance, though it welcomes the redundant saying that a being acquired suddenly the capacity the moment during which there is exercise of that capacity, losing the capacity the moment the thing ceased exercising the relevant capacity. Aside from Aristotle's concern, we have cause to criticize the McGarrick doctrine for yet another reason, a less obvious and notorious cause for criticism, a cause about which Aristotle's metaphysical considerations were too incurious to fully extrapolate. The McGarrick doctrine of capacity as activity entails a no less absurd thesis of incapacity, the one that I say readers of Arendt's trial report motivate. According to the McGarrick philosopher, a being is simply incapable whenever it is not exercising capacity, as I've said. To conceive of the incapable in this way is to presume, yet again, a simplistic notion of lack, such that a thing or being simply lacks or does not have a capacity for a given exercise when it is not exercising it. A full catalog of the absurdities Aristotle's criticism of the McGarrick doctrine would have included, if you were curious to do so, the criticism of equivocating between activity and capacity, but also the equivocation applying to latent capacities, the mere having of a capacity without exercise. And a vulgar notion of privation is simple lack. So once we reduce capacity to activity, then the idea of a latent capacity, a capacity without exercise, just becomes a mere incapacity. So the equivocation basically reduces capacity to a total lack. In other words, the consolidation of capacity and activity renders latent capacity a mere nothing. The McGarrick doctrine therefore repudiates the sense in which some being can be said to exist potentially. And I think Aristotle wants to take that seriously, that there is a sense in which we can exist only potentially, not actually. Aristotle has taught us, and I'll conclude with these final remarks, Aristotle has taught us that it is important to distinguish the being of capacity from the being of activity, in order to explain how things move, how they come to be, and how they pass away. But there are also important distinctions to be made among the varieties of ways a being is incapable or lacks a capacity, a variety the McGarrick doctrine disavows, in favor of a conception of pure activity as that which is not being exercised, or pure incapacity as that which is not being exercised, and therefore not real and not actual. For instance, we ought to keep separate the distinct ways a young boy and a castrated male possess the inability to sexually reproduce. They both have an inability or lack an ability with respect to the same exercise, but they have that inability in distinct ways, assuming for the moment that it makes some sense to say in this case that these beings have a lack. And Aristotle is aware of the paradox. That is, there are real distinctions among the way things actually are, to be made that the vulgar conception of non-being cannot get a grip on. As Aristotle would insist, it makes sense to say that a statue of Martin Luther King Jr. is, in a way, in the block of marble before the sculptor carves the image into the marble. And that the person who is not studying is a person of knowledge, provided that we add to these statements that the image of King is in the block of stone potentially, just as the person who is daydreaming is a person of knowledge since he has the potential to know. Moreover, we should further contend that a being exists potentially in such a way that allows further distinctions to emerge between this block of marble, which is potentially a statue or an image of King, and this heap of chocolate, which lacks the potential to become such a statue. In fact, among things or beings which lack the potential to become a statue, some may lack the potential entirely, like a pile of dust, whereas others may lack the potential at a certain time, let's say marble that happens to be at the bottom of the Mediterranean Ocean. And still, other beings or things lack the potential to become a good statue, such as carving the image of King into a large pile of frozen snow. Criticism of the McGarrick view of capacity as activity rescues the distinction between two ways of being actual, merely having a potential without exercise, and the exercise of that potential. But we should not discontinue, as Aristotle had, the rescue of those distinctions which identified the variety of ways beings persist without changing or developing because of a privation, and yet still continue to function in some way. Privation may also indicate that there is some degree to which a being is active in a deficient sense with respect to a capacity for that activity, and yet also be said properly to lack the capacity for that activity. One of the several senses of privation includes not only when a being lacks some capacity entirely, but also when it in some degree fails to have it. The McGarrick's vulgar doctrine of capacity as activity disavows the various modes of privation as ways of being. In a hasty conclusion, one of the far-reaching lessons of Arendt's report on the privation of thinking is that there is such an intermediate zone of banality which belongs to the general condition of human existence, and that means to each of the specific activities rooted in this condition. If banality is this intermediate zone of the general human condition, an inherent vicissitude of the many capacities of human beings, such that humans may exist or persist in a zone wherein they no longer have the capacity to start something new, and neither is it the case that they completely lack such initiative. This impasse, and not just thoughtlessness, as Arendt thought in the Prologue of the Human Condition, the impasse of the intermediate zone may be one of the outstanding features of our time. If Heidegger had a point when he said that Aristotle and antiquity had no metaphysical urge to further examine the zone of impasse, to the extent that for the Greeks it was the question about being, which above all and first of all had to render a comprehension of what is, then our post-metaphysical age seems just as incurious, and that includes Heidegger himself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. There's a lot in that you did very quickly.
Yes. You can go slow.
No, I'd like you to. So the zone of impasse, this zone of banality. I assume zone of impasse and zone of banality are similar in your. Are you distinguishing impasse and banality, or are you equating them?
Equating them, right? Yeah.
The suggestion here is that in the zone of impasse or banality, we are incapable in one sense, but also, of course, capable in another sense. Have this incapacity to think,
Right.
and yet there's a capacity, inherent capacity to think if one, because one can escape the zone of impasse or zone finality. Is that
Right.
right?
Yep.
I'm just wondering. So is this a claim that there is no one who's simply incapable of thinking on one level? I mean, is this the point that when Arendt says this almost total inability?
Right.
Is the almost the key word here in your view?
In my reading, yes. The almost is acknowledging the fact that as soon as we identify Eichmann as a man,
Yeah.
and therefore as a human being,
Right.
we've also ascribed to him a complex of capacities, one of which is thinking,
Right.
such that he is a human being in virtue of those capacities, one of which is thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But as a being that has that capacity to think, he has also found himself in a zone where that capacity has become hindered. But not in such a way that there's no activity
Mm-hmm.
whatsoever that one might call thinking, but in such a way that that activity is deficient.
Okay. So there's two. I mean, there's one part of this paper which is, in a sense, descriptive
Right.
of, from Aristotle to the present, our understanding of a different understanding of capacity, and that even back in Antigone's time, Creon didn't have to act legalistically and as a nobody.
Right.
He had a capacity. He was incapable, and yet he had some capacity.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sort of a descriptive, almost a historical descriptiveness, saying that man is not simply Danon, horrific and wondrous, but also horrific, wondrous, and banal.
Right. Or highly mediocre.
Or okay, but then
Mediocre in a sense that other animals and other creatures can't be.
right. So I mean, I call that descriptive. I mean, it's an ontological claim about man,
Mm-hmm.
right? In a sense, saying that the typical dualistic claim about man as Danon, as best and worst, as wondrous, whatever,
Right.
has to take into account this third element,
Yes.
right? I mean, we could even call it timos, if you wanted to go to a platonic,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's reason, there's desire, and there's thumos, or will,
Right.
in between. I don't know if that appeals to you, but there's an ontological level of argument being made here. I'm wondering, but there seems to be also a historical or claim that there's something particular about the post-metaphysical age, which you
Right.
just at the very end.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if...
How to get that on record?
Yeah, okay, get it on record, but now that you got it on record, can you elaborate what you want to say about that a little bit?
Well, in the most straightforward sense, it's just the utter disregard for reflecting on or studying Aristotle's metaphysics, and that's the cheap way. So the age that says that the study of being as being
Mm-hmm.
is no longer relevant to how it is human beings move and act and come to be and pass away. And I take it that in everything I've read on commentary, criticism of the Eichmann in Jerusalem book, it seems to be that no one really comes prepared with any metaphysical conception of what it means to lack something. And insofar as that's not even a part of the debate since '63, it seems to me that post-metaphysical can be roughly accurate.
So I just want you to say more. I mean, there's your total inability to think. What is thinking, right?
Right.
He's intelligent. He's a good bureaucrat. He moves up, right?
Right.
So people are thinking about what thinking is, and Arendt certainly was, and she offers an account of it as thinking. I mean, there's a couple, but one, I think most basically there's two. One is thinking is to think from the perspective of others,
Mm-hmm.
and thinking is to think in the two in one, where one can't be out of tune with one's own lyre, right?
Right.
From thinking in moral considerations and some questions of moral philosophy and other places as well. And so clearly she has an ontological understanding of thinking rooted in man as the being who either can or cannot, or does not live up to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly many people in reading Arendt have developed that ontological account of man, which she develops. I guess what I'm interested in, what's lacking in that account in your reading? Or what is it that you're saying is not being done in that account?
Well, two things I would say in response to that. I don't think that the inability to think observation in the Eichmann report, and then when she comes back to it in the thinking and moral considerations, I say, I don't think she ever expanded upon that notion of privation and applied it generally, not only to just the activity of thinking, but I think it also works quite well, not so much with labor, but with work and action, such that banality is not something specific only to thinking, but that it has different manifestations. But that's not, I think, a fault of hers. I just think that's part of the reason she actually made the observation correctly, because she wasn't interested in overly generalizing. But I think banality is something in the trial report that she doesn't fully develop. Mm-hmm. But she leaves open the possibility that banality is not just a feature of thinking, right? That it's insofar as it's related to thinking or thoughtlessness, it drives his evil actions or evil deeds. Then we can start seeing that banality has a much more, I think, pervasive effect in the human condition as such.
Yeah, banality is not limited to thinking.
Right.
Thinking, which separates us from ourselves in the idea of bringing us to ourselves,
right,
is the potential inoculation against banality in all of its guises, right?
Right. Yeah.
Jennifer?
I'm wondering if I'm understanding this correctly in terms of how you're intervening in discussions about Eichmann in Jerusalem. I'm imagining a conversation, like one that I've seen Roger moderate, between people who just don't believe, who just think that her account is horrible,
right,
and are saying, well, it makes no sense to say that he couldn't think. And I'm imagining you standing there and saying, okay, fine, it's not that he can't think, like, if you want to get technical, here are all the ways in which, there's a potentiality and an in-between space that he doesn't reach. And in order to kind of respond to those criticisms a little bit more fully, but also, right. So as part of that, I'm wondering if that assuages some concerns of those people who think that Arendt maybe absolves Eichmann of guilt,
right?
Because you're saying he has a capacity but doesn't use it. And so it kind of saves her critique for people who want to say no, but let's blame him.
Right. Well, the first issue, I would say there's a naive sense, and this is what I kept calling the vulgar McGarrick view. There's a naive sense in which we've forgotten that, for instance, when I can't fully see Joe from John, right? I can see the two human beings just walking in the room and that I know them, but my vision doesn't fully perform such that I'm allowed to distinguish and pick out John from someone else. There's a sense in which when I am seeing, I still would refer to myself as incapable of seeing, right? And that we use incapable and lack in that sense all the time.
Yeah, and it denotes something else.
Right.
Being blind.
Insufficiency or something.
Right, exactly. I think it denotes a form of activity in which the ability of that activity has withdrawn from its natural end. Right. So if thinking is the idea, if thinking for Arendt is the 2-in-1 or the silent dialogue with myself, then it seems as if inability to think, or almost total inability to think, means that Eichmann had a deficient mode of thinking such that it couldn't think the other, right, or the contrary, or even engage in some kind of two-in-one. It's like the breakdown of the two-ness of the two-in-one. So it's just a deficient form of oneness, if that makes any sense. And so then therefore people historians like Stangnath who think that evidence that look, Eichmann was reading Kant's Second Critique and he knew the Prolegomena, or he sort of thought hard about the moral imperative, right, is evidence somehow of some kind of refutation of Arendt, right? That's just silly, because we all know, and I think Arendt says this in Life of the Mind in part 1, that sometimes the most banal forms of thinking are those by professional thinkers, right? So there are ways in which you can read Kant poorly and deficiently, such that it doesn't act as a refutation of the inability to think, but in fact it shows you and manifests the inability right there.
But you're just bad at it.
You're just terrible at it, right?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. And the other thing too is if we are committed to the idea that one is totally unable, I think we lose, and I don't think Arendt was doing this because I think her task in the Arendt report, or in the Eichmann report, was something different. But I think if we refer to something as totally unable, we have a hard time giving an account of a person's life, of how they got to be where they are in that impasse. Because someone who is totally unable and they lack this, in the way that the table lacks thinking, you can't explain how something lacks got to the point of impasse. Whereas if you acknowledge an inability that connotes impasse, then you can start to give an account, I think a richer historical account of someone's life, of how they came to be stuck there, or never fully managed to get out of that. Yeah. Does that make any sense?
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say also that this project is really interesting to me. I stumbled upon these concepts of thoughtlessness and inability several times. So I'm really fascinated by your project and your return to Aristotle to move this debate forward. So the last thing you were saying to Jennifer, the connection between this activity in a deficient sense, I think it's right, the word you call it, also to divide up the idea that not thinking is passive and thinking is active, so therefore we should always aim for activity. But you're suggesting that there is a kind of activity involved in Eichmann's being that is active thinking in a deficient sense.
Right.
So to connect that to what you were saying about politics at the beginning, I mean, you were already saying that this way of thinking allows us to historicize how an individual can come to degenerate into this
Right.
Activity in a deficient sense. But you also seem to want to give a broader political, historical
I do. Yeah.
account of the
At least that's where I'm heading, I think.
dominance of this incapacity that's not passive incapacity.
Right. I mean, I think there's something said in, I think, the Crisis of the Republic book, I could be wrong, where she talks about the loss of political capacity. And the loss of the capacity to act being a distinctive feature of modern age. And that's where I want to intervene and say, can we be a little bit more exegetical, if you will, about what loss of capacity really means? Does it mean that it's been completely lost? Does it mean that we've lost it for the moment? Does it mean we've lost it in the sense that we're not fully activating it? So where in this intermediate zone, which I think metaphysics just breaks down, it can no longer be of any help, because it's sort of where the principle of non-contradiction no longer holds. Our concepts don't make any sense, right? It's a capacity incapacity. It's an activity which isn't quite an activity, and then we need, I think, really historically situated accounts of that particular form of activity and how it came to be there. So that's just one entryway. I'm not sure if that's responding to your interest or your question.
Sure, yeah. And then I was also wondering how this project relates to Agamben's project.
I don't know.
To whose project?
Agamben's?
I don't know. I've read his book on potency, and I've read his essay on Aristotle, and I can't make much sense of it.
I want to know how it relates to Arendt's project. Because it strikes me that you are trying to push Arendt's project forward.
Yes.
There's a way in which Arendt spends the 1950s, the 1960s, and even a little bit of the 1970s writing essays, right? In Between Past and Future and Traces of the Republic, which she calls thought exercises, right? Exercises on thinking, which are attempt to, as the cliche now, but thinking without banisters, thinking in a post-metaphysical age. Trying to exemplify what it means to think about freedom at a time when freedom is not obviously there. Think about authority when authority maybe disappeared. Think about thinking when thinking is something that is an ever more rare act. Her view is that thinking can never be extinguished from a human being, which I think you're agreeing with, but that we are putting ourselves in a position through certain situations and technologies and bureaucracies in which we have to think less and less, and in which we can get away with thinking less and less, and yet we have to keep the practice and the habit of thinking alive, and of acting, by the way, and of laboring, and of working, all of which are in retreat from her point of view. So it strikes me that, in a sense, you are embracing her project, but saying, I think that there was something she didn't do enough of, or something that she did but others aren't doing. And I guess I'm trying to get you, I'm interested in knowing, what is it is this a Arendtian project, or is this we need to add something to Arendt, and it's through Aristotle? I guess I'm just not understanding exactly what your connection.
I like to think of it as a Snyderian project.
Good. I love that. But what is the relationship Snyderian and Arendtian?
Well, for instance, if you take, I think the human condition is heavy on activity, right? Vita activa, the three activities, not so much thinking. This is just a broad outline. I'm not trying to summarize the book, but that's the orientation of the book. That's the breakdown of labor, work, action that divides the sections. But what's curious about that, and I think she's right to do so, which is put full priority on the activities themselves without, this is the Aristotelian moment, without a analysis in conjunction with activity of pure capacity, such that each of the activities, labor, work, and action, and thinking, have a relevant capacity.
Okay. That's really helpful. Can I ask
Now
you,
we can
ask a question about that? Because that's really helpful. There's a reason she does that, right? Which is that she's interested in the appearing world, the public world.
Which is an Aristotelian reason, I think.
Which is an Aristotelian reason. Which is to say that it may be that in private or in a non-appearing context, there's still some thinking going on, there's still some acting going on, and some work going on. But that these things only impact the common world when they're seen. And she has a strong sense that being means appearing. And so I guess if you were going to sort of resurrect capacity in a non-apparitional way, it seems that you're almost returning to metaphysics, whereas she's trying to leave metaphysics, which says that there's a much stronger being to what doesn't appear, right? And it strikes me that there's a way in which you're returning back to metaphysics as opposed to her trying to say, look, metaphysics is over. We need to focus on appearance, not just being opposed to appearance.
Right. Yeah, there's some tension there. I don't think, I never really understood the metaphysics is dead type thought. Especially given some of the things that she says, which I think support that suspicion of my own, which is that, coming out of the first critique, Kant's first critique in the preface, where he says, the inherent drive of reason is always to reflect on unknowns, like freedom, God, and the immortality of the soul, and it's never going to stop.
Yeah.
Right? Metaphysics might be dead as a science, in the sense that it will yield knowledge of being and being, but I don't think it's dead in the sense that human beings won't continue to think that way. Except, I would say, to use a term that I would take from my analysis, which is metaphysics is dead only makes sense if we understand by dead, or not happening, the fact that it's happening poorly. So that people are, even when they think that they're not thinking metaphysically, they actually are in some sense thinking metaphysically, and they're not even aware of it. And I think, in my version of a conversation with Arendt, if I had said that even about her work, I think she would maybe even admit that possibly that's true, right? That even her thinking is somehow metaphysical, but not fully metaphysical. But there was something else I wanted to come back to. And then, but I also think that there's this, regarding thoughtlessness, I think there is a tendency to think of thoughtlessness as a morally bad thing. And even maybe some of her later writing on thinking could lead us to that conclusion. I want to read her differently. Maybe this is just my projection on her. I think that thoughtlessness is morally indifferent. That in a sense, thoughtlessness can be, in certain historical situations, not just historical, but in certain ethical situations, thoughtlessness can be an asset. And I think you can actually...
She agrees with that, though. I mean, in
right.
the very essay you're reading, she says thinking is dangerous. I mean, everyone quotes that line, right? There are no dangerous thoughts, thinking itself is dangerous. She's talking about that in the context of nihilism. Thinking is destructive of all systems and worlds of existence.
Right.
And she says all thinking contains within itself the seeds of destruction and nihilism. It's dangerous. She says equally dangerous is not thinking or thoughtlessness, which can allow a system to in a banal way solidify and become totalitarian. And she says there are times when thinking is the right response, and there's times when thoughtlessness is the right response. They're both great dangers and risks.
Mm-hmm.
No?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I would agree.
something about that?
What?
I thought that in that essay, she meant that thinking can be dangerous, but if you don't think enough, you're thinking nihilistically. But that what is implied that it's a call for more thinking, rather than some
Well, I
kind
think
of
she says that
thoughtfulness.
thinking itself is nihilistic. I mean, that's the argument. Thinking, and this is Nietzsche's argument, thinking about truth eventually does what? Shows us that truth doesn't exist. Thinking destroys everything. And she says it's dangerous. But she says not thinking is also dangerous. And when we confront the two dangers, we'd rather have thinking than not thinking. But not all the time.
Thoughtlessness is sometimes an appropriate moral response.
Yeah, I think it has to
Just
be.
I think part of the human condition that we usually conduct ourselves with prejudice and things like that. It's just part of what we do. So does that, especially dangerous in dark times and so on. Political situations where it leads to catastrophic results. And I actually want to ask you, it's kind of a follow-up, I think, on Walter's question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but privation makes sense only in a framework of teleological conception. In Aristotle, a conception of human nature, for example,
Yes.
which there is something that is human, and there are other things which are not human. And in this framework, you can be less human. That's privation.
Mm-hmm.
And in Arendt, it just I think doesn't make sense because she's not a metaphysical thinker.
Right.
She doesn't have a kind of teleological conception. It doesn't make sense to speak about privation.
Mm-hmm.
We need to speak about the banality of evil in different terms, I think.
Right. Well, the thing is, I don't share the view that because we can't fully determine the nature of the human, that we can't say anything or pick out certain activities that manifest humanity, distinctively in contrast to other forms of life. I think Arendt shares that view. I think,
Doesn't she do that? She picks out 3
Exactly.
or 4.
Right.
Oh, you think she agrees with you?
Right.
Yeah, okay.
And I think Aristotle shares that view.
Yeah.
So I think in that sense, neither Aristotle nor Arendt nor myself has any interest in defining the nature of the human.
Right.
We only want to talk about those forms of activities which make humans appear as human, and allowing some. So
You think Aristotle does
Absolutely.
not have interest in that?
right.
About defining human nature and defining what is more
Yes.
humane and what is less humane?
Correct.
Okay.
No, I mean what I mean is that his account of the human in the Nick Ethics and in the Politics, but also in his biological works, is always, I think, what's presupposed in those accounts is that he is offering an account of action, of praxis. And the presupposition also has the consequence that he's not giving a definition of what it means to be human. He's giving a definition of what it means to act as a human. And that kind of account, especially in the Nick Ethics, can only be vague in general. It can only be a sketch. And I take that to be the same sentiment of the human condition. That these are the activities which so far most people seem to agree that these are human. So let's go with that and use that as a form of analysis. But your question about teleology, I think here is probably where I would break from many people who interpret Arendt as having some non-teleological account. I do think that there are, of the human, for instance, I do think there are moments in her writing which allow us to think about a kind of teleology of human activity. Right, just the simple phrase that action, the raison d'être of action is freedom. Right, if you translate that as a reason for being or the reason for doing, is to in some sense give that for the sake of which we act, which is a kind of teleology, right? What I want to do though is break up the teleology and say we act not only for the sake of one end, but we can act by the sake of the contrary end. And apply that thought and say there's the multiple ends within the human being, such that we can be the kind of creature that acts towards freedom, and we can be the kind of creature that acts towards its negation, and we can be the kind of creature that can live in the in-between, such that the in-between is also a form of the teleological here. We can actually aim for that. We can aim to be mediocre and live there our entire lives without even being aware that that's what we're doing.
I'm just wondering whether it wouldn't be better to put it in a framework, existential, phenomenological thinking and not Aristotelian thinking, because I think everything we said can be interpreted in a framework of not something teleological where there is some end there that is in a way more humane or I don't know. We all aspire to. There are different potentialities, and we can choose either one. There is nothing which is more in accord with some kind of human nature or human development is a vague word, but nothing actually pushes us through in one direction. We have different potentialities, and we need to choose. We can choose not to think, and we can choose not to practice thinking. It's not that we either have the capacity or not. We choose throughout our life whether we practice it or not.
I wouldn't go that far down the indeterminate route. I mean, I would want to say that. I mean, this is why I think natality, right, insofar as it's a capacity for the new. What that means is, if you use the language, the metaphysical language of Aristotle, that means that that the having of that capacity is oriented towards a certain kind of activity, like every capacity is. Right? You can't make sense of a capacity unless we've already defined in that notion of capacity the activity for which it's oriented. Right? Now, if we think of natality as that means that it has, I think, a primary teleology. Meaning it is oriented towards at least one proper object. That proper object is freedom, or to be unique in the space of appearances through the disclosure of the who. Right? Now I think that That doesn't mean, though, what I was trying to suggest maybe too quickly, that that's the only vicissitude of the capacity, that that's the only way it's going to go. In fact, because it's an activity of freedom, it's capacity for freedom, it's open to other avenues, right? But those other avenues, and here's where I get a little Aristotelian, pardon me, is to say those other avenues are incidental, meaning they're not properly the object of what it is the capacity for, just like the doctor's art is primarily a capacity to heal, but only incidentally does the doctor also have the capacity to, in an expert fashion, keep someone alive in torment or even kill them. Right? Now, certainly non-doctors can do that, but doctors can do it in an expert fashion. Just like I think animals can be non-political, but it's humans that can be non-political in a distinct way. I wouldn't say expert fashion, but in a distinct way. So it's a teleology with, let's call it incidental ends built in. And I think that would come back to your question, which is how am I furthering Arendt's project? And I think if we go back and reread Origins of Totalitarianism, I think with that conception of totality in mind, as having built into it a primary orientation, which is for the new, but then secondary and tertiary orientations, which are incidental, then we can start to read the emergence of the totalitarian movement as features of that natality being askew. And I think that changes the analysis a little bit. I think it's in spirit, in the same spirit as Arendt's work, but I think it would add more concepts, which will enable us to be more specific about certain things that have happened. If that makes any sense.
I mean, I guess one question I have, and I'm not sure if I'm just missing things, why isn't it an act of freedom to try and bring in a totalitarian form of power?
Why isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, freedom is the freedom to stand or fall, as Milton told us long ago. Freedom is not always good.
Right.
I mean, there's the only standard for judging action, we're told, is greatness, right? Not morality.
Right.
So, I mean, it strikes me that Arendt has no moral. She thinks judgment is important, and we should make moral judgments about which actions are right and wrong. But there's no absolute standard for those judgments in her writing. And action itself, to act and be free, are the same, but there's no necessary moral bridle on action.
Right.
I mean, that comes from judgment, just a different faculty.
Well, I would agree that it's the exercise of a perverse form of, I would call it perverse form of freedom,
Yeah.
that brings.
Freedom is always perverse. I mean, well, freedom, almost by, to the extent action is great, if you want to say really great, which means it's always going to be destructive of a status quo, which means it's either going to be a criminal act or a heroic act of some sort that creates something new. Freedom is always dangerous.
Right.
And somewhat perverse. I mean, well, perverse or beautiful. I mean, if you want to, takalos, right? Or perverse.
Well, I mean, I think we would just have a semantic issue, because I would say that there are greater and lesser forms of perversion.
Yeah, well, that's true.
And
Anyone who watched the Henlon movie knows that.
I have not.
Oh, yeah, we just showed it. Right,
I had to teach you what it's called.
Yeah. That's perversion in its extreme.
Right.
I mean, true perversion.
So even if we grant that all freedom is perversion, which, just assuming that we are.
Well, no, it
now,
can also be beautiful. Which
Okay.
I don't think is the same as perversion.
Right.
Do you?
Do I know? Not in this case. Not generally,
Yeah.
but yeah, I'm not so sure we disagree.
I'm not sure either. I mean, I'm just saying it strikes me that in characterizing Arendt's idea of freedom and action, one shouldn't say freedom and action are always towards beautiful.
Right. Well, then let me ask. I mean, what do people? Because I'm interested in what you think about this idea of giving the little bit of Aristotle I introduced, the idea of having the capacity for the new. Insofar as, thinking back to the Augustine quote, that before the human being, there was nobody.
I think that's right. And I think that her use of the Augustine quote, right, which is to say, with man, when man is born into the world, freedom is born into the world, right? And the idea that on the model of birth, we have this second birth of natality.
Right.
I think is at the very foundation of her thought, which is that no matter how bad it gets, freedom cannot be extinguished from a world as long as humans continue to exist in it. And that's why she says in that beautiful line at the end of Eichmann, the holes of oblivion do not exist. Which is why at the end of totalitarianism she'll say, it is impossible for a totalitarian government to persist indefinitely. Because there's always going to be some possibility for something new. Unless of course, the human condition as we know it, which includes natality, is eradicated, which is what the book The Human Condition is about. Are we losing? Are we really going to lose the human condition if we create artificial humans, mechanical humans, blah, blah, blah? Will we in some way lose that ontological capacity for the new? I think as I see what you're doing is using Aristotle as a way to, in a sense, bring out she turns to Augustine. Clearly she's reading Aristotle to bring out a deep Aristotelian background of the human condition. I think it's incredibly interesting and valuable, and to sort of use it to focus on this idea of potentiality. And in so much of her work, she's talking about how do we keep the idea of action and thinking alive in a world in which the space for action and thinking are ever more circumscribed. And her work can then be seen as a work of potentiality.
Right. And frankly, yeah, you're right to say that Aristotle is to use the instrumental language. That I'm using Aristotle in a Arendtian vein, but I think the converse is true. That there are things that I want to take from Arendt, specifically on freedom, that we need to sort of plug into the Aristotelian project, which is missing because Aristotle doesn't have it completely right. And I think natality is one of the concepts that allows me to do that. It may not be the most definitive one, such that now we can think of freedom as both virtuous and vicious in that double sense. Yeah.
This has been really stimulating, and I'm sort of racking my brains right now because I'm trying to translate into kind of idioms that are more familiar to me as an anthropologist. Sort of in the realm of anthropological accounts of agency and social theory. And this isn't maybe a rephrasing of some of the earlier comments. I mean, I'm interested in the zone of impasse and the possibility of getting out.
Right.
Because I think you leave open the possibility that it can be. I mean, if we've gotten into it, it's not.
Right.
It's not inescapable.
Mm-hmm.
How can you say more about how that kind of that escape might happen beyond just the fact that the possibility remains?
Yes and no. I think abstractly no. Concretely, yes. Meaning, I think part of the reason that I said that I pointed to the fact that Heidegger may have been right when he says that the zone has been, he doesn't call it a zone, I'm using my language. He says that the metaphysics of privation, of lack, or of inability where there's deficiency. He says the reason that Greek antiquity and Aristotle in really metaphysics sense hasn't been very interested. I think behind that is the insight that there's something inscrutable about this zone, that really our metaphysical concepts and notions break down. That if we're going to really think about this zone, we have to sort of let metaphysics go. And part of the reason is because metaphysics deals in generalities. and what we need is specificity.
Okay, right.
And so it might be that, for instance, Tom, who plays the piano but not well, so such that we say he is a terrible piano player. He is incapable of playing the piano, and and Linda is also incapable of playing the piano at time t. Right? It may be that we can do certain things for Linda, which might manifest or change the incapacity and transition it into a capacity, whereas for Tom we can't. And the only thing that I think we can do is not think about the zone, but we have to implement the right practices. Given the kind of impasse related to the activity that we're talking about.
Let me try to translate again, because I mean what you just said about abstractly, no, I can't say anything about how to get out, but concretely, yes, there is something to say. I mean, that makes me translating into kind of anthro speak. That would be to say this is an empirical question, meaning
That sounds right.
that we could actually look at specific cases in the past or the present where there has been kind of dramatic social and political transformation, and on an abstract level, accounting for that would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, but we can sort of do detailed kind of investigative work to construct an interpretation of, in this particular instance,
Yes.
how that transformation came into being, or how a particular impasse was reformulated, escaped, so on.
And I would say the premise of that kind of empirical research has to be that when we use the word inability, that there is, to pick out certain activities, that we're not confining it to the zone of the impossible. Right.
Right. That there's actually a differentiation of
that the zone sort of has an indeterminacy built into it, which allows for and also doesn't allow for, I think, breaking out of that zone. But talking about these sorts of things so generally, I don't think is very helpful unless we've guaranteed the truth of the premise. But as long as we continue to think that inability means total lack, then we're going to find students or other human beings who have that lack and then give up on them.
So the overarching here is a plea for optimism or hope.
Wow.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
all right. A lot of people think Arendt's a pessimist, right? But all of her essays end on a note of optimism or hopefulness. And what you're really saying is, let's stare the despair in the face, but let's remember there's always potential. And we need to think about what potential means and how to activate that potential.
Right. Or even prevent certain practices from generating human beings or leading human beings into that zone.
Right. That's very Aristotelian in the sense of habitus. I think that's what you have in mind, right?
Hexus, exactly.
Hexus.
Yep.
And is there a particular hexus here in the practice of reading that you're interested in, or is that different from what you're doing?
In the practice of reading.
Or reading or thinking? Is there a practice of exercises and thinking? Is there a hexus that you're engaged in as a philosopher, if I can call you a philosopher? A public philosopher, as one who does what you do? Or is this hexus going to be more like what you learn in, I don't know, elementary school or regulations that come out of Washington? What hexus are you interested in here?
I think, for me, that the hexus that I sort of embrace comes out, and this is where I find some commonality with Arendt, is maieutic. So, but for me, it's a reading of Plato.
Midwifery.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. So, in the sense that midwifery enacts a form of thinking contraries, thinking either side, such that we, as intellectuals or philosophers or some sort of thing like that, I don't know, we hold back our own opinions, our own thoughts, in order to generate the kind of thing that we do silently in our students, so that they think either side. But this is not, I don't think this can be, this silent dialogue or even this execution or exercise of thinking either side in speech or in thought is an end in itself. I think it has to be carefully thought of in relationship to thoughtlessness. So there's certain instances where we don't want to think either side, where we don't want to bother to think, well, this act might be just, this act might be, this might lack justice, which one should I do? And as we're carefully thinking either side, the moment for action has been gone, or passes. So that we lose the kairos, right? We lose the right moment for the right thing to be said in the right way to the right audience. And I think thinking either side has to also, it can't self-congratulate. I mean, you can't say this is what we need to do all the time. In fact, I think thinking either side can develop into a hexis when it starts to become deliberative instantaneously, where you've thought either side already, such that in your own habits for action, you're already doing the course. Or you're already going one course because you thought the other two.
We have time for maybe one question if it's brief. Any of the students have a question?
Well, I was wondering if you could to go back to the earlier, what you were talking about, the zone of impasse, how we enter that zone. Because you were talking about it in a couple different ways. One way I was interested in was sort of as an insufficiency, or almost as a retreating from some kind of natural ability. In the same way I might no longer be able to, determine which one of those trees is closer outside or something. I mean, is this like an atrophying? What would this natural ability look like, in its original form? Or is it something that we can condemn people for, this inability to think? How do you see this coming about?
It's a good question. I think I would look at, because I think this is an empirical, or this is going in an empirical direction. I would look at particular instances of the breakdown. So, for instance, this is why I think your question leads me to assert why I think the Eichmann book is so important. So that when she does use the language almost total inability, she also gives you an example, right, of Eichmann thinking that he's thinking with the enemy, right, or in support or pursuing justice for the Jews, but he's not even actually doing it fully, but he's doing it in part. Meaning he's having a conversation, he thinks that they have similar interest in this one situation, but he has no real conception of thinking the other side. So I think in this case, with regard to the intermediate zone, the best thing to do is to look at particular examples and ask, how could it come to be, or how can we prevent that kind of thing from happening? And it's a difficult question. I mean, in the classroom, when students think that they are pursuing thought rigorously, but they're really not, there's nothing you can really do at that precise moment to get them to see that. But it could very well be that a delayed effect happens, right?
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of trust that has to be built in. That there's something you're doing that maybe later on, belatedly, will emerge, and they'll figure it out.
Isn't that what Socrates does to students?
Right.
Are you saying you do that?
I try.
We're going to have to end there, because time-wise, but you can follow up. All right. Thank you. Please join me in thanking Charles Snyder.